Hello everybody, happy Monday. Welcome to Unoptimized Evolution. I'm Eric Jacobus. I wanted to talk today about generative anthropology. The study of language has been going on forever, ever since we could talk probably. And many of the 19th century and 20th century theories on language were a combination between historical studies of grammar and sort of this emergent Darwinian idea that language is just communication. And a lot of these theories were sort of dancing around the issue, and they both had something to offer. And it seems as though, in my reading of the study of linguistics and just the history of linguistics, that nobody really quite got it. Talk about any kind of origin of language was, such a problem for linguists a lot of the time, because you might have a very coherent theory as to, your how your grammar works, but then how can you explain where a word comes from? There was a linguistic society of Paris in the late 19th century that actually banned discussion about the origin of language because it was just such a difficult topic. And so Eric Gans came up with a theory on the origin of language. He wrote a book called The Origin of Language. And essentially what Gans created here was an idea that language emerged as an event. It wasn't something that gradually happened over a long time span. It was just something that happened in an instant. Now, the backbone of this origin of language theory comes from René Girard. And this is where things get really sort of interesting, in my opinion. But first, I think what I'll do is I'll explain what the Originary Hypothesis is and try and best explain Gans's theory on the origin of language. You have to sort of imagine a scene. You imagine that this scene is a bunch of what would be proto-human hominids, whatever it might be. And these hominids are not yet capable of using language. Okay, we won't get into exactly what language is. We're just going to sort of, whatever your understanding of what language is, just assume that these hominids did not have that. Now, these hominids are gathered around some kind of center that is going to cause them to erupt into a fight, right? And Gans would say that that center is most likely like a carcass, like an animal carcass. Derek Bickerton might agree with this. Derek Bickerton's idea in More Than Nature Needs was that language emerged or evolved gradually as we became, what did he say? Our special problem was that we were confrontational scavengers. So as we became more confrontational and more scavengy, we needed language to cooperate. There are a lot of examples of these very kind of gradual theories on language. So Gans proposes that instead, no, this is not something that gradually happens. At one point you don't have language, and at one point you do. So in this case of these hominids gathered around a carcass, or prehumans, whatever you might call them. At one point, you have to realize that animal societies, chimpanzees, bucks, elephants, whatever it is, think particularly about like carnivorous animals. So lions, again, I think chimpanzees is probably the best analogy. If they're gathered around a carcass, well, how do they decide who gets what part of that carcass? How do they decide who gets the whole carcass, right? And it's not really that they decide, it's that there is an alpha. Could be a male, could be a female in some animal species. And that alpha will decide that they're going to take that carcass, and every member under them is the beta. And then at the end is whatever your sigma or omega, whatever, I don't know. I don't really keep track of the Greek letters. They get a share, right? And usually the closest sort of compatriots of the alpha will get the first dibs on the leftovers, and then whatever's left kind of gets doled out to whoever. And so in animal societies, animals are sort of optimized, I would say, Gans doesn't use that terminology, but he does say that animals have a system, an alpha-beta relations system, that essentially allows the distribution, not equally, but there is something of a distribution of a resource. In this case, it's a carcass. It might be the case with mates too. Alpha takes first dibs, betas get the rest. And then the betas have their alpha, that alpha decides how those, it's just this hierarchy, right? And that hierarchy is mediated through combat. And combat within, say, chimpanzees is not necessarily direct combat. It might just be a threat of combat. It might be intimidation. It might be shaking branches in a really interesting way that scares everybody else off. And that's enough. And that will secure the alpha, the necessary obedience from the crowd, so that the alpha can partake in however much they want. Or the actual combat engages, the alpha wins, most likely wins anyway, and then gets whatever they want. Now, that also means that a beta can challenge the alpha. Anybody can challenge the alpha, technically. And within chimpanzee societies, you have these very complicated coalitions where you'll have these very intelligent betas that sit at the sidelines for a long time, sort of waiting for an attempt to go and challenge the alpha. Jane Goodall talks quite a bit about this in Through a Window. Richard Wrangham, he talks about it in Demonic Males. And this is just a strategy that chimpanzees will use to get a coalition large enough in order to challenge the alpha. The coalition will understand that if their alpha, their sort of sub-alpha or their alpha-beta, whatever it is, if their alpha becomes the primo alpha, then the original alpha is going to be knocked out. Their entire group and all of their coalition is going to be knocked out as well. And so the new alpha with all of their coalition is going to become the new sort of champion of the society. And when looking at animal combat is very frequent. Animals engage in combat quite regularly. There's a good study, and I'll link to it in the description if I remember. Sorry, if I forget, just tell me in the comments, and I will happily link to all this stuff. I just forget. There's a study that shows that chimpanzee aggression happens at 1,000 times the rate of human aggression. And in terms of aggression, I mean, it's very difficult to quantify that, right? Like chimpanzees chasing other chimpanzees around in an aggressive way could be categorized as a fight. If a human chases a human around like that, would you call the police? It's very difficult, right? So in the study, it's between 500 times as often and maybe 10,000 times as often, depending on how you would define aggression. So they have a huge, in other words, humans are aggressive with each other only a fraction of the number of times, per instance, that chimpanzees are. And yet chimpanzee lethal aggression occurs at the same rate as humans. So within the chimpanzee aggression, their rate of lethal violence is the same as human lethal violence. I wouldn't call chimpanzee lethal aggression violence, really. I would just call it lethal aggression. That means that there's a death involved. Now, chimpanzee lethal aggression doesn't typically involve more than one death. It's very rare for chimpanzees to slaughter more than one, and that's why events like the Gombe Civil War are so sort of strange and out of place, because how can chimpanzees slaughter so many other chimpanzees? So 10 chimpanzees dying is very strange to witness, and yet with humans killing 1 million humans in a civil war, 40 million in World War II, it's just sort of like expected. We sort of anticipate that if we were to engage in another world war, that we would probably, I don't know, would there be 100 million people dying? Who knows, right? So all this is to say that animal aggression is far more, it occurs far more frequently than human violence does. And this requires a little bit, and this does require some clarification, because one could say that humans are aggressive all the time with sports, arguments, potentially escalating domestic, things that don't quite become domestic violence, but are maybe it's verbal abuse, right? And we have to bear in mind that almost all of these situations are pretty well encapsulated within some kind of legal framework, right? So for example, combat sports. Humans are aggressive all the time in combat sports, although those are heavily confined within the rules of sport. Even human war is technically encapsulated within rules. There's very little tolerance. There's actually no tolerance for any kind of human aggression outside of laws. There's just no tolerance for this. There is limited tolerance, very limited tolerance, for a world war that's within the Geneva Conventions, right? I mean, everybody sort of like tries to act very quickly to end those things. So what does all this mean? This means that animal aggression, far more common, far more reliable, and far safer for, in the case of the chimpanzees surrounding the carcass, it's far more likely to be the way that the animal carcass is doled out. In fact, it's probably the only way. It doesn't seem like animals really resolve these issues in any other way. There's going to be a pecking order of some kind. That pecking order may not present itself as open combat, but there is most likely some kind of combat in the past that set that hierarchy. With dogs, that dog probably nipped the other dog at one point. That chicken probably pecked that other chicken at some point, and that pecking order is established so that those combat loops don't have to be engaged in anymore. Okay, so if we're imagining these proto-humans, these hominids, whatever they are, these non-linguistic semi-people, it's annoying to me that I have to bracket all of this because I don't think those are people. These beings, these non-linguistic beings who are gathered around this carcass, at some point, it's too dangerous to fight. And the Originary Hypothesis says that, well, when mimetic escalation is too great, right? And this is René Girard's mimetic theory was outlined in Violence and the Sacred, and then his idea of escalation to extremes in Battling to the End, the idea being that humans mimic the desires of each other. We don't actually produce our own desires out of a vacuum. We just sort of adopt the desires of other people. And Girard said that includes the tendency to scapegoat, the tendency to blame an individual for all the problems of the community. And there's a lot of truth to this. In fact, we do this every day, and that'll be a different video. But the Originary Hypothesis uses this as its springboard. The idea that humans within a situation like this where tensions are very high are going to mimic each other's aggression, violence toward each other, resentment. And whereas Girard says that the result of that is some kind of human sacrificial victim, which is the origin of society, Gans instead says, no, what that does is the threat of violence produces the need for a sign. This is the first word. So mimetic violence becomes so great that these proto-humans have to produce a sign. And for Gans, I think that he believes it was some kind of a gesture, although maybe he's agnostic about this. I'm agnostic. I don't know what that first word would have been. I don't even know if this situation could have technically happened. But the hypothesis says that in this scene, the first word, the first sign, the first linguistic sign is produced. And so the first linguistic sign is the center. It's the center of human relations. And if you want to think of it literally, it would literally be that animal at the center. It's kind of a cool cover that he has on his book, New Way of Thinking. You can kind of imagine, I don't know if that's the point of this, but there's a center there, right? All of the attention goes toward this center now, which is the carcass that's being disputed. And perhaps the signal signifies the carcass itself. Perhaps the signal signifies the fact that the carcass is greater than everybody else. Whatever it is, this new signal inaugurates egalitarian society. And what that means is that instead of everybody fighting over this thing, instead of an alpha fighting the betas, right? Because again, mimetic escalation has made the alpha perhaps too timid to do this. Or maybe it's made a beta on the outside realize, hey, this is too dangerous. We need a sign instead to get out of this situation. Whatever it is, somebody creates a sign because violence is imminent, it's too dangerous, so they all have to share the animal, and that is the inauguration of egalitarian society and language. And so in future situations where everybody, again, is surrounding a carcass or whatever resource is under dispute, then they can use that same signal. They can use that same word, that sign, whether it's gestural, verbal, both, whatever it is. Might have been, I tend to think I think it's likely that it was something like a rock that was cut, that was used, but who knows? It's impossible to really know. But I mean, logically makes sense that there was a first word. So that first word now can be conjured and can be used, I guess conjured is the right word, in future situations. And then that would technically resolve that, right? And so the division of the carcass is probably the first animal sacrifice. And so there you have it. That's essentially the originary hypothesis. And then from there, Gans has quite a breakdown of how language proceeds from there, starting with the ostensive. The ostensive is the word that designates the thing that you're basically pointing to. Sacrifice, God, whatever it is, you're pointing at the thing. Center. Who knows? Who knows what that word was or what it sounded like? The ostensive, later it becomes the imperative, which is if it's not there and you say that word, carcass. But if it's not there, that means bring the carcass to me. And then later on, the declarative, talking about the carcass when you're not near the carcass, right? I won't go into too much of that. That stuff is really fantastic, though. It's a great analysis. Even though it's very hard to read, it's worth reading. They re-released this. Adam Katz did an introduction to it. Origin of Language. It's much smaller, much more slimmed down, much more readable. Apparently. I haven't read it, though. So the originary hypothesis is that. It's very powerful because it's an event. It's a moment that you could point to on a timeline. This compared to, the very sort of mainstream views on language, which say that language gradually evolved over time. I'm reading Robin Sperling's book right now, and he's talking about 5 different characteristics of language that had to be, like joint attention, intonation, all these different aspects of communication that had to be good enough before language could evolve, right? And it's like all these different qualities that like Darwinian style thinking, you have to imagine all these things can emerge before language evolves, right? And it's just like, it's very difficult to imagine all of these evolutionary strains becoming language. And it's almost like the more you look at it that way, in this gradual way, the more complicated it gets. And that's why there's not really a theory on language. As far as I can tell, Gans is the closest one. And I'll say that outright. Like, I totally endorse that idea. Now, there's one thing, though, that has always bothered me about the originary hypothesis. And that is, why was violence so dangerous that a word had to be created? Why would language have to be created? There's no explanation within the originary hypothesis about what the nature was of that violent scenario. And that's how I came up with the ROBA hypothesis. After a whole, it really, I literally would lose sleep over this. I was thinking in my head, okay, if you have a bunch of chimpanzees potentially coming to blows, and everybody's escalating to extremes, okay, but why? Like, how is that actually apocalyptic, right? How does any one person or being in that situation, how do they intuit that this is so dangerous that everybody could die? Like, it's not worth having combat over this anymore. How can that happen? Because to this day, no animal society will do this. Of course, you'll have animals backing down from fights. Of course, it's at a certain point, it's not worth it for an individual animal to fight, right? That's like a standard maneuver. Back down, don't want to fight, right? Especially when you know the alpha is already powerful enough. That's not the issue. The issue is, why would everybody engage in this like sacred process of creating a sign instead of allowing a fight to happen? And that does not work if all of the participants in this scene are just empty-handed. It can only really be a threat if they are threatening to pick up rocks and smash each other up. But the thing is, no animal does this. Chimpanzees will only use objects for intimidation. They won't actually engage in stoning, right? If they were to do that, if they were to throw a rock, inevitably the chimps will just start bashing with their hands. It's almost like, and yet they'll use objects in very complex ways for smashing nuts, or for fishing for termites. If they're fishing for termites and they get so far, they don't just start smashing the tree trunk. They keep on working the tool. And so there's like a very intricate part of the chimpanzee brain that has access to object usage, whereas combat does not seem to have access to object usage in any animal, let alone chimpanzees, which use objects for a lot of other things, just not combat. Only for intimidation again. And so the question then becomes, okay, well, if humans are the only ones who do this, well, when did they start doing that? Because that would be the prerequisite for that sign to come about. The ability to use recursive object-based aggression, ROBA, is the prerequisite for creating an apocalyptic scenario which would necessitate a sign. So when did that start? Frankly, I don't have any interest in figuring out how humans first had ROBA, or what species had ROBA first. I don't think that that's important. That can be for someone else to figure out. What it does do is it does show a more minimal human quality, which is the capacity for ROBA. There's also the option that humans had ROBA for a long time before, and this would be this is what Gans describes as multiple aborted attempts at making a sign, right? Multiple aborted, well, it may not even have been an attempt to make a sign. It may have been just a failure to resolve this situation. And if they were using ROBA at the time, they might have just all scattered, right? And then maybe when they came back together again, everybody starts throwing rocks and they all scatter. Maybe this happens for a year, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, I don't know. But at some point, the sign emerges and it sort of takes the place of ROBA. And that's why my thermodynamic model says that, when you use objects recursively like that in combat, well, that's using recursion, because you have like infinite tactics going on in your mind. You don't really, and by the way, you don't really want to throw that rock, because as soon as you do, someone's going to throw a rock at you, right? So this is sort of the paradox of it, is like, who would cast the first stone anyway? And maybe without the ability to use language, maybe people cast the first stone really quickly. Like maybe as soon as you basically run out of the memory space of theory of mind, which is like 6 orders of intention or whatever it is, intentionality that Robin Dunbar describes. Yeah, maybe after 6 orders, people just start throwing rocks. But how long then would it take for an individual to figure out, like, wait a minute, whenever I do this, I start getting hit in the head with rocks, like it's not worth it. And maybe then that's when the rock became its own sign, right? And so that's like one possible hypothesis as to the first word. Might have been a rock that was modified slightly to show, I'm not going to use this, I'm going to modify it, and this is my word that I carry around. Again, no way to really know this, but the fact that these are everywhere in the world and they all look basically the same, to me is pretty good evidence that these were more linguistic than useful. Also, when you hold one of these things, it's like really difficult to know like how you even hold this without hurting yourself. Because if all the edges are sharp, like how do you hold it? Anyway. So the ROBA hypothesis is not a negation of the originary scene. It's simply to fill in a little bit. There's a little gap in there, and I'm just filling it in to show that there's this extra quality that people have that no animal has. Where the fact that we can use ROBA, that is what necessitates the sign. If it's just a bunch of dudes who are gonna, bash with their fists, that just is not dangerous enough, because then chimpanzees, if that were the case, then chimpanzees would be making a sign all the time. And there's no evidence of them doing this. They have like various, indexical signals. They can They can communicate in various ways, but they don't have symbolic representation. And I won't go into that very much. Read Terence Deacon's book. He talks about that. He claims that we can teach chimpanzees symbolic communication or bonobos or whatever, but all of this is sort of like, I think we're splitting hairs at a certain point, because if chimpanzees can't use ROBA, then they just don't have the capacity to make that sign. They just don't have the capacity to make symbolic language. And when I say symbolic language, I don't mean communicative language. I mean the idea of saying, that's God. We don't fight. That's God. Now we have some kind of like verticality to the situation. We can carry that around with us and avoid this situation in the future. That is different, 100%, from any chimpanzee communication. Even if you were to teach a chimpanzee to memorize, a holy scripture and memorize the name of a god, it would not know it the way that humans do. And it would not harken back to anything originary, right? And so what I love about the Originary Scene is that it gives like a fresher, in my view, I think it gives a better genealogy of language. It gives a better etymology. Because if the first word is the sacred, well then anything from that first word is sort of like an elaboration on the sacred. And there might be some things that are used, you might be able to take pieces of that word to say like, okay, well this isn't, that tree isn't God, but that tree sort of like conducts God with lightning, right? And you might then start worshiping the tree as a result. Whatever it is, you can sort of like trace human culture through the partitioning of this word in billions of ways, right? And then you can take those little pieces and recombine them in interesting ways to further describe the world. That's the amazing thing about human language. And that's the thing I think that without understanding the sacred, the human communication sciences are getting nowhere very fast. So I hope I steelmanned Mr. Gans's hypothesis properly. I've met with Eric many times. I love talking to him, and I always learn something speaking to him. Adam Katz, who did the introduction to original language, incredibly intelligent, and he's really helped me with this ROBA hypothesis as well. This could not be possible without the two of them. I present at GA conferences every year. I love doing it. They're always very welcoming. Every member has been very supportive, and they ask amazing questions too. And so all of them have been so good at, pushing this and testing it and, asking the hardest questions. They are the ones that ask the hardest questions. If you think you're so smart, ask me a harder question than somebody from GA, seriously. And somebody please respond to, the original language theory. I mean, this hypothesis has not really been, in my opinion, like nobody's really tried to take it down. And that's not good. Like that to me is evidence that people may just not want to look at it. This is what I keep going back to with the issue of communication sciences, is that anytime you posit some kind of sacred origin of language, communication sciences break down. They don't really know how that's supposed to work. I mean, for example, the origin of the word red. Red is always the first word that comes after dark and light, or white and black in a language. It's always the first color word after that. Why? And the Originary Hypothesis makes it very clear. Well, it's the color of blood, and that's the same blood that all people have, and so it allows you to sacrifice animals in your place, because animals also have red blood. And then, in its more, I guess you would say, in a degraded form, it allows you to sacrifice other people in your place, right? So human sacrifice is sort of predicated on the understanding of red as a universal color. That's far different than a communication scientist who would say, well, red is the thing that people want to talk the most about, because we've got a cone in our eye. We've got cones in our eyes that respond to red, and we want to be able to pick out berries and poisons and stuff. It's just not as compelling, because it's also very important to talk about green. In fact, it would seem as though green would be the more important color to discuss. Why wouldn't you want to talk about blue? Why wouldn't you want to talk about all these other colors, right? And it turns out that those colors are just not as sacred as red. because animal sacrifice is always first, and what comes after animal sacrifice? Vegetable sacrifice, which is the green thing. So then after red, green is usually the color that gets introduced. It's either green or yellow, right? So green and yellow, those are the colors of vegetation. Anyway, the world just makes way more sense when you think like this. I'm trying to convey this to as many people as possible. So far, the videos have been taking off a little bit. Last video got twice the views of previous videos, which is good. So I hope that you all try and destroy this hypothesis in the comments. I know that Girard did comment on it, but he kind of like, and this is sad because Gans was, I believe, Girard's student. And Girard didn't really even, he said it's like some kind of social contract theory, which is just like, you're not really taking it seriously if you just see it as social contract theory. So I would encourage Girardians especially to take this hypothesis very seriously, because it is built on mimetic theory, but it does sort of abandon the scapegoat theory that Girard had. And I'm going to do that, I'm going to explain that in a different video. I think I need to reread Violence and the Sacred first before I do that. But I do have a pretty good understanding of Girard's escalation to extremes. But in essence, Girardian mimetic theory hypothesizes that at the origin of human society is the human scapegoat. And the evidence of this is like all these institutions that we have that still maintain human sacrifice in some kind of symbolic form. Like, regicide becomes the, regicide meaning the sacrifice of kings becomes the power of kings, really. Like when you, as a sacrificial victim, when you start to understand the power that you carry, you can become a king technically, right? This is sort of scapegoat theory. So it's got a lot going for it, except that Gans is saying, well, that doesn't have to be the thing that created the first word. It could have been an animal carcass. In fact, it most likely was. So Gans is doesn't really buy the idea that it had to have been a human sacrifice. The ROBA hypothesis, in fact, doesn't really care. ROBA hypothesis just says that ROBA is a minimum human quality, and that or it's a minimum human property, along with language, and that that there's a transference of recursion from language into ROBA, language into violence. Okay, I hope that was thoroughly confusing for everybody. Please leave comments, smash that like bell, and subscribe with that button or whatever they say. Thanks.